This is the new ZEB Enduro fork from RockShox. First off, here's a few things you're going to need to know about the new ZEB fork. Now, just like Fox's 38, the ZEB also uses 38mm upper tubes. That's these bits here, otherwise known as the stanchions. RockShox are offering this fork to work with either 650B wheels or 29-inch wheels, and the travel ranges from 160mm up to 190. There's 5 different ZEB forks in the RockShox lineup, including this Ultimate version, which uses their top tier Charger 2.1 RC2 damper. Now, we can't obviously talk about a new fork without mentioning offsets. Now, RockShox are offering the 29-inch version, as you can see here, with only one offset option, and that's 44mm. If you do go for the 650B version, you'll have the choice of either 38 or the 44mm. 4 of the 5 ZEB forks will use RockShox standard Debonair spring, which was recently updated for 2021. There is one alternative though, and that's on their e-bike version, which is the base ZEB model. Now, this comes with the option of having a dual position air spring. That means you can adjust the travel, which should help make your bike more efficient when it comes to climbing. Now, why did RockShox go for a 38mm chassis? Well, for me at least, I've always found the Lyric, which uses a 35mm chassis, more than stiff enough. But obviously, there are a lot of benefits coming from a stiffer chassis, and if you can execute it well enough to blend that extra stiffness and still deliver enough comfort, then you should be onto a winning formula. Now, making a fork too stiff is going to make things far more uncomfortable, with too much deflection through the bars, and it's going to hurt your hands on really long runs. So it's going to be a really tough balancing act to make sure that RockShox have managed to couple enough flexibility and forgiveness, but also enough stiffness to make it feel really precise in the turns. For the most part at least, I generally found the Lyric, which uses a 35mm chassis, more than stiff enough. But there's definitely times in certain situations when you can feel it flexing a little bit. Now, I had no real issues with that, but obviously I know some riders will. RockShox aren't the only one to settle on the 38mm chassis, as we've seen in recent months with Fox releasing their 38 Enduro fork. Now, the only comparison I'm going to make just quickly, because I haven't actually got a Fox 38 here and I haven't ridden one due to the lockdown restrictions we've had, is that the ZEB is in fact cheaper and lighter than Fox's equivalent, which is pretty interesting. This Ultimate model with a cut steerer actually weighs 2,245 grams versus the 38, which my colleague Seb has in the same 170mm travel 29er option, actually weighs 2,363 grams. Now, I've already briefly touched upon the stiffness that you're going to get through the 38mm chassis. Now, compared to a Lyric, which is the current Enduro fork from RockShox, they claim the new ZEB is 21% torsionally stiffer. Now, in theory, that should mean that the new ZEB fork is going to feel really accurate and precise when you're slamming through the turns, especially if they're rough and loose and full of roots and rocks and things like that, which is great. 4.5 stiffness is only increased by 2%. That's the bending back and forth, and then the bending stiffness is upped by 7% over the Lyric. To combat any increase in friction due to upping that chassis size, RockShox has spent a lot of time working on bushing length and overlap in order to fight any kind of binding, so the fork should work more smoothly as it works its way through its travel. Every model of the ZEB fork also uses Maxima plush damping fluid and their SKF wiper seals. Obviously, a big burly fork like this, you might think that it's going to use a 20mm axle as you'd see on the Boxer downhill fork, but in fact RockShox have said that a really well executed 15mm axle should be just as stiff, and so that's why they have gone for that in this case. Now, if you saw my video on the SID fork that launched earlier this year, you might see some similarities with the new ZEB. So if you take a quick look around the fork crown and the arch, you can see it's quite angular and sculpted. The fork arch also sits quite far off of the stanchions. So according to RockShox, that's for improved clearance at bottom out. So not just around the head tube, but also if you're using a fender that bolts onto the arch, it will improve that clearance too. And just like the SID fork, the back of the ZEB's arch also has 3 small screw threads, so you can direct mount a fender onto the back of it. I don't have one on there right now, simply because due to the coronavirus, shipping has been delayed, so I'm still waiting for mine. But if it's anything like the ZEB one, it should be pretty decent. The ZEB's crown is forged then machined, just like that of the ZEB, and it actually comes in a couple of different size options. Now, these different sizes have no bearing on how the fork actually performs. It has no effect on the stiffness or anything like that. It's, according to RockShox, merely an aesthetic, just to prevent having that step from head tube onto the crown. Mine, in fact, is actually the larger of the two, and so it does have a bit of a step, but it's not something that really worries me. Other things to note about the construction of the new fork is that the brake mount is a 200mm direct post mount, so you won't get any discs smaller than 200mm bolted in place there. Its axle to crown measurement is in fact 5mm shorter than the same travel Lyric, if you're to compare the two. And max tyre clearance in both the 650B and 29er versions of the ZEB is 2.8 inches. The ZEB uses RockShox Debonair spring, which was recently updated for 2021. Now, in essence, this works in exactly the same way as the updated version that we've got in the Lyric right now, but obviously because the chassis size is slightly different, they're not cross-compatible, so you couldn't put the ZEB airspring into a Lyric fork, simply because the sizing is just slightly different. But in feel and on the trail, essentially they should feel pretty much identical. Saying that, RockShox have actually changed the shape of the air piston and the top-out bumper, saying that it will just improve how the fork behaves as it fully extends. Compared to the Lyric, the ZEB has a larger overall air volume. Now that means you actually need less air in your air spring to make it feel similar to the equivalent on the Lyric. Now RockShox say that even just a few PSI change will be noticeable on the trail, so in theory tuning should be more straightforward. You're talking single-digit changes to make a significant difference. But like the rest of the RockShox range, if you do want to change how progressive the fork feels, you can alter the volume of the air spring, and that's done just by adding the small tokens to the underside of the air top cap. The ZEB still uses the grey tokens, so if you do have a bunch of tokens left over from other forks, don't worry, they will still fit. So while 4 of the 5 ZEB forks will come with the standard Debonair spring, there is also the dual position option, which RockShox are aiming squarely at the eMTB market. Now, for example, if you have a 180mm fork, the dual position spring will allow you to reduce the travel down to 150mm just by turning a dial at the top. That will then steepen the head angle, steepen the seat angle, and make climbing, in theory at least, more efficient. So just like the Debonair spring, the charger damper is exactly the same in how it feels and rides, but again, it's designed to fit this new 38mm chassis. On the Ultimate version you can see here, it's the Charger 2.1 RC2. That means you've got 2 different types of compression adjustment, both high and low speed, and you've also got rebound adjustment too. In the 2 base models of the ZEB fork, RockShox are actually launching a new damper called the Charger R. This is based on their Charger RC damper and comes with a factory set compression setting. That means you can't adjust it externally, but you can still adjust the rebound damping. In theory then, it just means there's fewer dials to play with out on the trail. Great if it's just a case of getting out on your bike and not having to spend too much time with setup. Now obviously everyone wants to know how much something like this is going to cost. I do have some notes so I can tell you. So the base model fork, which uses the Charger R damper, costs £679. You've then got the dual position air spring, so it does cost a little bit more, but it has the same damper as the standard ZEB fork, which is the Charger R, and that costs £779. Then we go up to the ZEB Select, which uses the Charger RC damper, and that costs £779. You've then got the ZEB Select Plus, but that isn't available aftermarket, so that will just be on bikes that you get from your bike shop. And then the top one here, as you can see, the Ultimate, which uses the Charger 2.1 RC2 damper, and that costs £969. RockShox are also offering Airspring Kits if you did want to alter how much travel your ZEB fork has, and this will set you back £42. Or if you buy one of the cheaper forks but decide down the line you want to upgrade it and stick the top end charger 2.1 damper in, you're looking at £325. Now, I've had a little bit of time on the new ZEB fork. Unfortunately, due to the current pandemic situation and the restrictions that are widespread across our country, I haven't been able to really put them through the paces. Getting over to Wales isn't something that we can currently do. Places like Bike Park Wales, which are much faster and rougher, are a really good place to get to grips with the fork and do a lot of back-to-back testing. But what I can do is just give you a brief rundown on how I've been getting on with this fork so far. So I did actually manage to do a couple of back-to-back runs with the Lyric that was on this bike previously. And now, while the track that I was riding on wasn't particularly rough or steep, a way that would really test a bike or a fork like this, it did actually throw up a few interesting little points. The first thing I did really notice was you could feel a difference through the bars in terms of how the fork steers. So the ZEB just feels that bit more accurate. Again, as I alluded to at the start, it was never that I had a big problem with how the Lyric was working or had performed in the same situations, but the ZEB definitely feels that bit more pinpoint. I guess that's what I want to try and say, really. And it works really well. It's super smooth and it seems to track the ground that bit better than the Lyric. Now, as I moved to different locations as the restrictions were lifted, I got to test it on steeper and slightly more technical tracks. And on the big compressions, I had no real issues with bottom out or anything like that. And I've actually just got the one spacer in there. When it came to setting up the airspring, I simply went off RockShox setup chart. Now, my weight sits roughly in the middle of their bracketed weight recommendation. And so I just went for the firmer end of the pressure that they were recommending. And it seems to have worked really well for me. Since setup, I haven't actually had to change it. The fork feels supple. It's really easy to get moving. It seems to sit in its mid-stroke well. There's enough support when I push it hard into a turn. And as I said earlier, it tracks the ground really, really well. So when it's come to traction, as the conditions have got faster, drier and looser, I've had absolutely no problems with the ZEB so far. At 68 kilos, I was a little concerned that maybe the shift to this new chassis, which is stiffer, was going to cause me some hand pain. I remember in the past riding the old Fox 40, which was a really stiff fork, and that fork needed muscling around the turns, and it did give a lot of feedback through the bars. But thankfully so far I've had no such issues with the new ZEB fork. Obviously, like I said, I'm going to need to go and ride some much longer, rougher tracks and use other forks to test it back to back with. And so until I've done that, I can't really say for sure, but right now I've had nothing but good experiences so far. That's the new Enduro fork from RockShox called the ZEB. It uses the 38mm stanchion just like Fox's 38, but which is going to be better on the trail? We'll have to wait and see. What do you guys think of this new breed of Enduro fork? Is it a must-have or something you can simply do without? Let us know in the comments down below. And don't forget to like and subscribe and click on that little bell icon so you're always up to date with whenever we upload a new video.